What you know, Alibis? Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. It's Thursday, May 15th. Hope you guys have had a good day so far. Mine has been amazing. My son found out today that he passed his EMT national certification test and he graduates tonight. So it's a happy day around Gigi's house. We're going to jump right in. Back on the stand was Maureen Hartnett. She was still on cross exam. There was no testing of any alleged taillight found on scene for biological materials, things such as blood, saliva, or skin cells. As far as the hoodie and the t shirt, she did find debris on both pieces and combined those scrapings. She explains the scrapings removed the debris. And the reason she combined from both the sweatshirt and the t shirt into one container is because the clothing had already commingled and it wouldn't be appropriate to separate those. There's no description of the actual debris she found, such as whether it was fibers or hair. She really didn't do any examination. She just packaged it. There was also no note of any plastic, but she said that's not part of her analysis. She will shake the bag to be sure any debris that settled on the bottom comes out. They show the evidence bag filled out by Trooper Proctor. The clothing was collected January 29th from the hospital. She doesn't know the journey of the two items before she received them. There were clippings from John's fingernails from the autopsy, and those were submitted. A Norfolk detective unit submitted those to the lab. She has no knowledge of the chain of custody of any of the items prior to those being sent to the lab. On redirect, back to those red Solo cups in the paper bag, she had never seen blood preserved in cups like that before. She only saw scratches to the right side of Karen's SUV, nothing on the left or in the middle, and there was no hair anywhere else other than the one she found. She did do a microscopic exam of the hair that was found on the car. Right before she was finished, she wanted to correct something from her testimony yesterday. The judge let her go since both questions from both sides were completed. Irini Scortabello, she is the medical examiner. The autopsy took place on January 31st, and there were two law enforcement officers in attendance. They have no role in the autopsy. They are allowed to observe or ask questions, and law enforcement can take their own photos during the autopsy. She says the goal is to have their autopsy reports finished within 90 days, mainly for the families if they need a death certificate, but they can go past those 90 days if needed. They bring in the body diagram noting the injuries on John. For the face, there was the right upper eyelid, 1 centimeter tear. There were scrapes on the front and left aspect of the nose. There was a 1 centimeter laceration, which is a tear in your skin, on that right upper eyelid, as well as scrapes on the front left side of the nose and swelling and bleeding of both the eyelids. They did not show these graphic photos on the stream, but she does point out the facial injuries. As far as the chest and stomach, he did have fractures from the resuscitation attempts, but otherwise, no injuries. For the legs, there was a small scrape on the side of the right knee. On the top of the right upper inner arm, there were superficial scrapes. On the right back arm and forearm, multiple scrapes, which range from 2 to 3 millimeters to 7 centimeters, or around 2.6 inches. He also had 2 bruises on the back of his right hand and a faint scratch on the back of his left hand. They moved back to that right hand bruising. The bigger bruise right in the center of the hand has 2 small pinpoint defects. She points out they sometimes see this when an IV is started on a patient. It's also common for the skin around that to bruise where you get an IV, but she can't say how the other bruising on his hand happened. As for the arm injuries, they were what she referred to as scrapes or scratches, but there was no exposed underlying fat or muscle. She measured the length, but not the depth of the wounds, and she cannot say how these injuries occurred. As far as the internal exams, he had fractures to the fourth and fifth ribs that are closest to the sternum on the front side, and that is due to the attempts to resuscitate him. On the back of the head, we had that laceration to the right of the midline of the skull, and then there was a scrape over that. That laceration was about an inch long or 2.5 centimeters. For the internal exam, the back of the head, there was blood under the laceration, as well as skull fractures in multiple areas. She said those multiple skull fractures at the base of the skull corresponded to the area where he had that laceration. When she removed the brain, there was bleeding on top of the brain. So she preserved the brain and sent it to Boston, where a colleague examined his brain and then issued a report. As far as toxicology, there was no prescription or illicit drugs in his system. They took two different blood samples to do the blood alcohol level. The ethanol in the heart blood was 0.21 grams per deciliter. They also did fluid from the eye. That was 0.28, which would indicate he was legally drunk at the time of his death. Her conclusion was the cause of death was blunt impact injuries of the head. That was the primary, and hypothermia was a contributing factor. But as far as a manner of death, it was undetermined. On cross, there are 5 manners of death they consider: natural, accident, self-harm, homicide, and undetermined. Of course, they focus on undetermined, which is what she concluded. When she is trying to determine the manner of death, she will rely on police reports, crime scene reports, and statements. She is familiar with Michael Proctor, and he informed the medical examiner's office around the time of autopsy of the working law enforcement theory of a collision of a motor vehicle versus pedestrian. There were multiple people calling into their office saying they thought this was a person versus a car. They published a photo of 2 people in the morgue. At this time, she can't determine who it is, but she does a little later. She also notes she was at the Cape Cod facility for this autopsy due to a staff shortage. She's asked if there is protocol for law enforcement when they observe an autopsy. There is a sign-in sheet, and I'm pretty sure she said a shield number. I rewound it a few times, and I really couldn't make it out, so I hope that's right. Let me know if it's not. In March of 2022, Trooper Proctor sent her photos from the scene and wanted to schedule a call to talk about the status of his investigation. The witness requested their medical legal investigator contact Trooper Proctor to set up that phone call. And she said since it had been a few weeks since the autopsy, maybe additional information could be provided that she could add due to the fact she was still in that 90-day time frame to finalize her report and issue the death certificate. She knew enough from the autopsy to tell what killed him, but not enough to determine the manner of death. The death certificate was issued on April 14th of 22. She concluded hypothermia at autopsy after finding consistencies with hypothermia, as well as information given to her that he was found in the snow. She did not consider other reasons why his body reached that temperature, and she had no other reason to think something like sepsis would be a reason he died of hypothermia. They talk about the scientific method. Did you consider he could have died somewhere else and been placed there? There is an objection, and the judge tells the defense to move along and they can come back to it. The defense asks about alternative scenarios that she looked at. She said, I don't come up with hypothetical scenarios for how those injuries occurred. The defense asked if the head injury caused John to be unconscious, and she said at some point, yes. They asked if John fell backwards on frozen ground. Would it produce the kind of pattern seen, or would it be more shaped like a starfish? The witness says a fall backwards could produce the kind of injury John had, and the defense asks about flat frozen ground. She said it's a possibility, and there's nothing inconsistent with that head injury and a fall backwards onto a blunt surface. The defense asked if a fall backwards, would she expect to see grass in his hair? She said she did not see any signs of grass. The defense points out there's a number of possibilities that could cause these injuries. Regarding hypothermia, the witness made that diagnosis partially based on what she saw in his stomach and his pancreas. She saw bleeding in the lining of the stomach, as well as information she got from Trooper Proctor, which helped her to conclude hypothermia as a contributing factor. The defense says the witness previously testified the internal organ injuries could have been caused by something besides hypothermia if the body had been found somewhere else, or first responder attempts to save him with chest compression machines. The witness says that machine could cause damage around the stomach, but not in the stomach. However, the compression machine could cause pancreas bleeding, and she considered the first responders' life-saving attempts in her decision, but in the end, she stands by her determination of hypothermia. The defense asks about Wisniewski's ulcers. They're small, superficial bleeding lesions in the stomach that happens during hypothermia. The defense says that John had none of these ulcers, but the witness says that's not true. She just called them something else. They show the jury a photo of John's stomach and points out the lining and the folds. She points out the red dots, which is gastric bleeding. The defense points out she did not call these hemorrhaging Wisniewski's ulcers. They go back and forth about the ulcers, about different levels and grades of the ulcers. We're not going to get into all that. It was very technical and kind of hard to follow. The defense asked about frostbite, and she did not see any signs John had frostbite. She's asked if she saw any evidence of impact injuries, and she did not. There were no broken bones or leg bruises. As far as the right eyelid laceration, she agreed this is not from a fall to the back of the head, but it could be consistent with being punched. As far as the right arm injuries, she cannot determine the cause of those wounds. The defense says you noted there is a pattern to the wounds. Are those injuries consistent with a dog bite? There is an objection that's sustained. John's clothing was removed at the hospital and did not come with him for autopsy. On redirect, she has handed her grand jury testimony transcript. There are objections flying left and right here for a hot minute. She has to take the findings in the context presented to her. So in John's case, the hemorrhaging and his body being found in the snow indicates hypothermia. When she is given her report, she now remembers the two officers in the morgue were Connor and Keefe. The witness was aware EMTs heard Karen say, "I hit him," and then she later learned Jen McCabe heard the same thing. She had also heard from people on scene that there had been drinking that night as well as the arguing. The witness says the bruise to John's knee could be from a side swipe of a car, and the cut on his nose could possibly be from broken glass, plastic shards, or aid being rendered. On recross, the defense brings in the medications John was taking. One of those was an antacid for stomach ulcers. The witness says alcohol use can cause stomach ulcers, and she concurs. It is an alternative explanation for the stomach ulcers seen at autopsy. But even with all that, she cannot determine the manner of death. And that was it for today. So don't forget tomorrow at 9 Eastern, come watch with the Alibiers. We'll be there all day live streaming. And then tomorrow night, of course, I'll recap the day's testimony in an hour or less. Hope you guys have a good rest of your evening. We will see you soon.